Hello, everybody. It is so great to see you. And we are so grateful that you decided to take some time out to come to a class about Second Temple Judaism. If you ever wondered what happened in between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament in that time period that clearly existed but isn't written about in the Bible, you've landed in the right place. And Tom has done just an excellent job pulling together this material and working with some of the others in the teaching ministry to prepare these sessions for you. So I'm going to hand it over to Tom after a prayer. But please note his camera is not working. So we will see if he's able to get his other computer working. But if not, you just get to hear his lovely voice and the screen. So let's go to God in prayer. Dear God, thank you for loving us, for guiding us, for protecting us, for giving us hope. Thank you that your word is living and active, that you have the Holy Spirit reside with us as a community, that you are constantly looking for ways to use us to be shaped by you and to have an impact on the world around us. God, despite the pain and chaos and division in this world, thank you that you have knit us together, both individually, but also as the body. As your community. And God, help us to just proclaim your word day in and day out. Thank you for these opportunities that we have to dive deeper into different topics and help it to not puff us up, but to make us more equipped to see the world clearly and to understand your will and the direction that you have for our lives. God, we love you so much. Help tonight's class be inspiring, and thank you for giving Tom the Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Bob, for the prayer. Right, the microphone is working, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with the camera. I've been trying to figure it out. The other computer was loading so slowly that, well, it was just time to get started. And so anyway, I mean, I got a shave for you guys and everything, and you don't really get to see it, but you will get to listen to the dulcet tones of my voice, share some stuff with you. Now, you guys know I'm in this program, and about a year and a half ago, they gave the course offerings, and one of the courses they were offering was Second Temple Judaism. And my first response was, Second Temple Judaism, what does that mean? Why would anybody take that class? But then when I read the course description, I was kind of like, wow, this sounds really, really amazing. And so when this was offered to you guys, because we kind of have turned this into a class for you, you may have had a similar response. Second Temple Judaism, what does that mean? Well, Bobby told you a little bit already, but basically we're going to look at the period of the Second Temple that begins in the Old Testament and ends in the New Testament. And we're going to look at a lot of stuff in between that really isn't written in the Bible. Okay, so tonight's going to be a history lesson about the temple, right? Okay. So here's our plan for the next 4 lessons. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the history of Second Temple Judaism. In week 2, Ted Gill's going to give us a class on how did we get the Old Testament? Why that 39 set of books and not some others? Okay. And then we're going to take a week off, go have Thanksgiving and all of that. And then we're going to come back, and Jeff Michelle is going to teach us about sectarianism. Okay. If you look at the Judaism in the Old Testament, and then you look at the Judaism in the New Testament, they were very different. You know, in the New Testament, you have the Pharisees. Where did they come from? What did they stand for? You have the Sadducees. Who were they? And Jeff is going to teach us about that. And then I'm going to come in the last week. I'm going to talk about the Messianic current. What were they expecting out of a Messiah? And did Jesus, fit their expectations? So that's what that last class is going to be about. And so if you guys are ready, let's go. So let me give you a little background, okay? Solomon's temple. Solomon built a temple that today, in today's dollars, it would be worth billions of dollars, okay? So that was the first temple, right? And if you're interested, we're not going to dwell on the first temple other than it getting torn down. But if you're really interested, the temple, the details and where all that money went, is told in 1 Kings chapter 5 through chapter 8. But then, as you guys know, the Israelites were wicked and kind of not obedient to God. And so God sent the Babylonians in to conquer them. And Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians come in 586 BC. And the temple gets destroyed. Many of the people and the gold from the temple gets carried off to Babylon. Now, I want you to notice this, as people are being taken into captivity, Jeremiah says this, and this is recorded in Jeremiah chapter 29, starting in verse 4. And I'm going to paraphrase it. Basically, God uses Jeremiah to tell them, you're going into captivity. You might as well settle down, get married, have families, because you're going to be there for a long time. You're going to be in captivity for 70 years. That's what God tells them right at the outset. Well, I didn't mean to do that yet. So they're in captivity in Babylon, and then the Persians come along and defeat the Babylonians. Okay, and the Israelites then are no longer subdued by the Babylonians, they're subdued by the Persians. Here's what it says in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles is written after they return from captivity, and this is right at the very end. Okay, notice, I want you to pay attention to a few things here, right? It says, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place, right? He loved his people and he loved his temple. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. He carried them to Babylon. He carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple and broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. He carried into exile into Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests, and all the time of its desolation is rested until 70 years were completed to the fulfillment of the words spoken by Jeremiah. So the writer of 2 Chronicles is making sure you understand everything Jeremiah said was going to happen, happened. In the first year of King Darius, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. Okay, so God was setting everything up. He was punished them for their sin. 70 years later, he brings them on back. Okay, and again, the point is, everything happened just like Jeremiah said he would. 70 years after going into captivity, the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great sends the Israelites home with a command to rebuild the temple. You read about in Ezra chapter 3, you read about them laying the foundation of the second temple, okay? So from the laying of the foundation of the temple in Ezra until the temple is destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, that period is called Second Temple Judaism. And what I plan to do tonight is give you, I'm covering about 700 years of history here, okay? And I'm trying to do it fairly quickly. So we're going to move fairly quickly through all of this history, but I'm going to try to give you something of a historical overview of the stuff that you may not be familiar with because it's not really talked about in the Bible. That 400 plus years that, you know, that the Bible isn't really speaking, okay, that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. And I hope it will answer certain questions for you, okay, like, well, why is the New Testament written in Greek or something, stuff like that, okay? You guys ready? Here we go. We'll start with the Persians. Okay, so Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539, And shortly after, sends the Israelites back under a guy named Zerubbabel. Now, a lot of the history, so you might know some of this history, a lot of it is covered in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Parts of Daniel and Esther talk about this as well. Daniel tells some of the story while they're in Babylon and some of the story in Persia. Esther all takes place in Persia. So the story of the Israelites is covered in Israel through Ezra and Nehemiah, and then outside of Israel in Daniel and Esther. The prophetic message is given by three different prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And the Persian Empire lasts for about 200 years or so until they're defeated by the Greeks somewhere in the mid-4th century BC. Now, again, the Bible tells us some things. We don't know that much about the temple during the Persians, other than what the Old Testament tells us. And something we do know, though, is that they get back and they don't go to work on the temple. God sends a message through Haggai to Zerubbabel and to Joshua. That's recorded in Haggai chapter 1. Okay, now let's look at that real quick together. Haggai chapter 1, and I'll read the first few verses. It says, in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor in Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's temple, or the Lord's house. When the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai, is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up to the mountaintops and bring down timber and build my house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. Okay, and you can read that on your own sometime, but I want you to understand, basically, here's what's going on. The people have returned to Jerusalem, but they're focused on other things. And so God's house is still a big pile of rubble. Basically, it's a mess. Well, they're living their lives, doing their thing, but God is thwarting their plans, the things that they are, trying to accomplish. God's thwarting their plans because they're not working on his house. So he sends them this message, build my house. And so they obey, they do. And they build the temple. And in Haggai chapter 2, verse 9, God is pleased, and he says this, that the glory of this new temple would surpass the old temple. Now, that old temple was glorious. I mean, it gold everywhere. This new temple paled in comparison, but God is saying this new temple would surpass the old. Why? This is what I think. I think that the new temple was going to surpass the old for one reason, that one day Jesus would be in it, and his glory would surpass the glory of the old temple. Okay. Before we move on to the Persians, I do want to make note about Aramaic, the Aramaic language. Okay, we understand, like, if you're in the business world, like international business, English is sort of the language that is used, right? That's my understanding anyway. I've not done any international business, but you have what's called a lingua franca, or a common language, a language that's used. Well, Aramaic was the common language of that region. That the Babylonians used it, the Persians used it. And so when the Israelites go off into captivity, they learn Aramaic. And so while they're in exile, they're speaking Aramaic and Hebrew. But after a while, Aramaic being the common language for 70 years, it's the common language, they really start using Aramaic more. Parts of Daniel are written in Aramaic. And so when they return to Judea, they continue to use the Aramaic language. Most scholars believe that Jesus and the disciples in their everyday language weren't speaking Hebrew, they were speaking Aramaic. Okay, so the Aramaic language stuck around for a long time. There are things, words that if you're a student of the Bible, you've heard before. Abba, right? Father. Talitha kum, right? Little girl, get up, right? Jesus said these things, and they're recorded by, the gospel writers. These are Aramaic words, not Hebrew words, okay? Korban, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Those are words in Aramaic, not Hebrew, okay? And so the Persians, if only for the Aramaic language, they make an impact on Jesus' life several hundred years down the road. Okay, so let's move on. All right, before we move on, I do want to share, I found this little timeline, okay, to look at, all right? And so you see 586, the fall of the Southern Kingdom. You may notice, hey, look, that doesn't look like 70 years when the first Jews returned with Zerubbabel, okay? If my math is good, that's only, 49 years, right? 49 is not 70. But do notice this, when did the temple get restored? Okay, if you do the math there, 70 years, okay? And so they are in captivity for a long time, but they're walking along without that temple, without that place where you go to be with God for 70 years. The Greeks. So let's move on to the Greeks. All right. So in 331 BC, Alexander the Great comes along and he defeats the Persian king Darius III. Now, he conquers the whole region, basically, and there was a legend that most historians don't believe, but a legend that Alexander comes to Jerusalem, makes a side trip, special trip just to Jerusalem, and bows down before the high priest. Did he really do that? Probably not. It's more likely, most historians believe that probably the Israelites, recognizing that Alexander was going to conquer and he was going to be the guy now, instead of the Persians, that they sent an emissary to him to say, okay, we submit to you as our new conqueror, and to sort of give themselves over to the Greeks. Then 8 years later, Alexander dies, and he dies without an heir to his power. And so his kingdom gets divided. And so on his death, and you can see the map there, okay, his kingdom gets divided into four parts with four different rulers. And they are, Cassander has that green area, Lysimachus has that orange area, and then there, I don't know why they chose this color, whoever made this map, but that blue area at the bottom that looks, the same color as the Mediterranean, that's Ptolemy, and then the yellow area is Seleucus, okay? And so those four guys rule over the former empire of Alexander the Great. And Jerusalem and Judea happens to fall under the reign of the Ptolemies, okay, for about 100 years. However, about 200 BC, okay, the Ptolemies are fighting against the Seleucids, the descendants of Seleucus, right? They're fighting against each other, and the Seleucids win. And so Antiochus III defeats Ptolemy V and takes over that whole region. That's Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great, that I have the bust there for on the bottom. And so now they're still being ruled by the Greeks. It's just a different group of Greeks than what had ruled before. So the Seleucids and Hellenistic reform. Okay. Most historians think that the Jews at the time were pro-Seleucid, anti-Ptolemy. Okay, it's probably sort of one of those the enemy of my enemy is my friend situations, right? And so they welcomed the Seleucids and Antiochus III in Jerusalem, and he rewarded them for their support by granting them the right to practice their religion. Okay, and that goes on for a while, but then he dies, and his son takes over, Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He takes these privileges away, and he works to Hellenize everything. He's trying to make everybody Greek. Okay, he's trying to spread the Greek language, the Greek culture all over the region and everywhere else for that matter. And a lot of the Near Eastern cultures adopt some elements of Greek culture that they like, that benefit them, and try to ignore others. But one thing that kind of gets adopted is the language. Okay, and so why is the New Testament written in Greek? You kind of have Antiochus Epiphanes to thank for that. Okay. Whoops. I think I missed a slide there. Okay. So Greek culture starts to synthesize with various Near Eastern cultures, and the Jews were no exception. The Jews start to be Hellenized as well. And the Greeks now in control, or the Seleucids now in control in Jerusalem, they build a gymnasium, which was a very Greek thing to do at the time. And it became the center in Jerusalem for Greek learning. And there were a lot of people in Judea that embraced this, that were striving to be just like the Greeks, because you got rewarded if you were, came like the Greeks. If you Hellenized, you would get rewards, and those who didn't do it were punished. In First Maccabees, okay, this is considered part of the Apocrypha now, but it was written during this time period. It tells about the Maccabees, and in First Maccabees 1:15, it says that some people even tried to remove evidence of their circumcision so that they could fit in better with the Greeks. Okay, so here's what happens that leads to a big revolt in Jerusalem. In 168 BC, there are two different priests in Jerusalem, both of them, trying to gain power, had bribed their way into positions of power. They begin fighting with each other over which one of them was going to be the ultimate power. When word gets to Antiochus Epiphanes about this, he thinks that there's some kind of revolt going on. It was really more of a civil war, but he sees it as a revolt, and so he wants to put down this revolt. So he sends his troops in, and so the Seleucids suppress all Jewish worship and stop temple sacrifice. They take over the temple, and then they profane the temple and pollute the temple by bringing in prostitutes and having sex in the temple. They do all kinds of terrible things, but the most profane is they start offering sacrifices to their own gods, unclean animals like pigs. And so for those who were refusing to Hellenize, this is like the last straw. This pushes them off the cliff, so to speak. And so a resistance movement starts, led by the Maccabees, okay, led by Judah Maccabee and his brothers. And what they do is they actually are victorious. They win some military victories. Now, they don't take over all of Judea yet, okay, but they do have enough victories to take the temple back and to reclaim Jerusalem. So they reclaim the temple. They purify the temple, because they had really profaned it badly. And so they're able to purify the temple. And so it is this recovery of Jerusalem by Judah Maccabee, this recovery of the temple, that is celebrated in Hanukkah. That's what Hanukkah is all about, because the Seleucids had profaned the temple so badly, and the Maccabees have won it back. All right. So then what happens? The Hasmoneans, okay? The Hasmonean Dynasty. Now, you may think, well, what does that mean? I've never heard of the Hasmoneans before. Well, the dynasty itself is named after a guy named Hasmoneus. There's no Hasmonia, okay? It's not a region, it was a person. And he was an ancestor of the Maccabees. And so their dynasty became known as the Hasmoneans. Well, Judah Maccabee gets killed in battle in 161 BC. So if you look at the map that I put on there for you, that the lightest shade of pink is kind of the region that Judah Maccabee controls. And as it moves further away from Jerusalem, the pink gets darker and darker and darker till it becomes red. And that's the areas that they win over time. So with Judah, it's just that part around Jericho and Jerusalem. But his brother takes over and he leads this revolt for another 18 years until he's killed too. And another brother, a third brother, Simon Maccabee, takes over. Well, by the 140s BC, the Seleucids are having trouble themselves. They're fighting amongst each other. Plus, there's this, sort of new power on the block called the Romans that they're kind of dealing with in other places as well. So Simon sees this as his chance. He negotiates with the Seleucids to rule Judea, okay? Because the Seleucids have their own problems. They finally say yes. And so First Maccabees 13, 41, and 42 say, in talking about Simon, that in his negotiation here, that the rule of the Gentiles was removed from Israel. So now, finally, after all of these centuries, Israel, at least in part, is ruling itself. And again, you can see from the map, it takes a little while for them to get some of these other territories, but they do eventually get more territory. And so they gain independence from Seleucid rule in 140 BC. 5 years later, Simon dies, and his son John Hyrcanus becomes the leader. John Hyrcanus rules over Israel for about 30 years. Okay, and as you can see, he takes over Idumea, and he actually forces the people of Idumea to convert to Judaism. Okay, but you can see again, I put the map on this slide as well, how things spread over time. When John Hyrcanus dies, his son Aristobulus takes power, and he's the first of the Hasmoneans to call himself king. He becomes King Aristobulus the first. When he dies, his brother Alexander Jannaeus takes over, and then when Alexander Jannaeus dies, his wife takes over, Alexandra Salome, and she reigns for 9 years. That's Alexandra Salome at the bottom there, that coin. Okay, and then she dies. She has 2 sons. Okay, she and Alexander had 2 sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. The problem is they both want the power. Hyrcanus is the older of the 2. Okay, and so sort of by the nature of things, he's the one that's given the throne, but Aristobulus kind of rebels against that. And so they go through something of a civil war, with Hyrcanus declaring himself Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus declaring himself Aristobulus II. They're both trying to get the throne. They both appeal to Rome for help. They both appeal to a Roman general named Pompey for support. Now, Pompey kind of prefers Hyrcanus because he sees Hyrcanus as the weaker of the 2. But ultimately, rather than choosing a side, he basically just marches on into Jerusalem and takes over the city himself. And so now we're no longer an independent rule, but now under the realm of the Romans. Okay, so they had a pretty good run there for about 80 years, but now the Romans are in charge. Pompey does the same thing that the troops of Antiochus Epiphanes does, in that he goes into the temple and he enters the Holy of Holies, something he wasn't supposed to do. But instead of offering profane sacrifices, he ends up deciding not to harm the temple. He purifies it and leaves it unharmed. So, Pompey does the right thing there, at least. Okay. So Pompey decides to appoint Hyrcanus as high priest, not as king, okay, because Rome right now is in charge. So Pompey appoints Hyrcanus as high priest. Hyrcanus and his advisor Antipater actually become pretty powerful, even though Pompey is the one that's running things. But Pompey gets killed. Mark Antony and Julius Caesar have him killed, and then they give Hyrcanus Roman citizenship and make him not king still, but ethnarch, which, is another, just a title that they give him, but he's kind of running the show. But it doesn't take long, okay? He dies, and his son Antigonus takes over. And Antigonus is the last of the Hasmoneans. Herod the Great manages to kind of get rid of Antigonus in something of a coup, and he ends up being the king. Okay, in 37 BC, he hands Antigonus II over to the Romans for execution. So Antigonus is the end of the Hasmonean line, and now it's the Herods. Okay, the Herods are running the show. Herod was a shrewd politician. Okay, he often, at times, would side with the wrong side, and then he would kind of go and apologize and still end up landing on his feet. Okay, so he was made king of Judea in 37 BC, and he served as a vassal to Rome. So he answered to Rome, but he was still the king of Judea. There's a few things that, references. There's more than a few references to Herods, various Herods in the Bible. He's the one that refurbishes the temple. Okay, during his reign, he starts a project to refurbish this temple to the point where, it's so much better when he's done that it's almost like he rebuilt it. Okay, you may remember in John chapter 2, verse 20, Jesus makes reference. He says, tear down this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Okay, do you remember that? What was his response, or what was their response? Wait a minute, it took 46 years to build this temple. They're referring to Herod's refurbishing of the temple that took 46 years. Of course, Jesus wasn't referring to actually destroying the temple and rebuilding it, but that's what they just did. He was being literal. Herod the Great is also the one that Matthew gives credit for the slaughter of the innocents in Matthew chapter 2. But then Herod dies shortly after Jesus' birth. And after his death, his kingdom, just like Alexander's had been, gets divided into 4 parts. Okay. Just one more little note on Herod that I found interesting. I don't know if it's true or not, but it has been recorded. It was recorded that Herod's last command was to round up hundreds of people and hold them in like a Colosseum. And so that when he dies, these people would all be slaughtered so that people would mourn his death. Is it true? I would like to think it's not true, but it is recorded that that's what he did. So Herod, while he did a good thing in refurbishing the temple, he did a lot of bad things too. Maybe he didn't deserve the name Herod the Great, but that was the name that he got. Okay, so as I said before, his kingdom was divided into 4 parts. Okay, and you can look at the map. Okay, Herod Archelaus became the tetrarch over Judea and Samaria. That's the blue part of the map. Herod Antipas became tetrarch in Galilee. That's the purple part. Philip becomes a tetrarch in territories to the north and to the west of Herod Antipas. And then Salome, who was his sister, okay, gets those little pink parts. You see a couple of parts that are pink. She's placed over basically 3 cities within the realm there. Okay. Oh, let me go back for a second, make mention. Herod Archelaus is mentioned in Matthew chapter 22. You remember the story, after Herod dies, Joseph is told, hey, it's safe to go back, Herod is dead. But when he hears that Archelaus is tetrarch in Judea, he's afraid to go to Judea. So he kind of goes on back to Galilee, and that's how he ends up there, because he's thinking, how much better can Herod Archelaus be than Herod the Great was? Okay. The other Herod that you really read about in the Bible is Herod Agrippa, okay, who Paul appears before in Acts 25, somewhere around 60 AD. And so those are the Herods. It was Herod Antipas that had John the Baptist killed, and it was Herod Antipas that sees Jesus, that Pilate sends Jesus to, not Herod Archelaus. So let's talk about the Romans. Rome had been expanding, by the time Pompey comes along in 63 BC, Rome had been expanding for a few centuries now. The Israelites had gained independence for a little while under the Hasmoneans, and they were loving that, I'm sure, taking the foreign yoke off and then being forced to have it back on again must have been a terrible blow for the Israelites, because, they made this assumption that they were God's chosen people, all right? And as God's chosen people, they were not destined to be ruled over by Gentiles all the time, okay? So Herod the Great dies around 4 BC. Again, his kingdom is divided to the 4 heirs, with Herod Archelaus getting Judea. But he has it about 10 years before he's kicked out by the Romans because of mismanagement. And so Herod Antipas stays in power in Galilee, but Rome takes over Judea again. Now, at this point, it's 10 years after Herod has died, they issue a call for a census to be taken. And this is not the same census that you read about in Luke chapter 2. This one is taken for tax purposes. Now that Rome is in charge in Judea again, they're going to tax them heavily, okay? You can imagine they were already probably taxed pretty heavily, and there's no way that the taxes were going to go down. And so the census for tax purposes leads to riots and a new revolutionary movement that we will talk about. Either Jeff will talk about it, I'll talk about it, but this new revolutionary movement, because they do not want to be under the yoke of the Romans. So Rome ruled through governors. They would send governors there, the most famous of which obviously is Pontius Pilate, but they would come in not knowing anything about Jewish tradition and being completely apathetic to it as well. They don't know, and they don't want to know. All right. So again, the best known of these governors is Pontius Pilate, who ruled for 10 years from 26 AD to 36 AD. Pilate clashed with Jewish leadership a lot on a number of different topics. He did not have a very good reputation among Jewish leadership. Okay, Roman historian Tacitus, okay, note he's a Roman, it's not a Christian historian, okay, it's a Roman historian. He rates Pilate's rule as poor, okay? Just like our modern historians, they'll look at past presidencies and they'll say, hey, he was pretty good, or hey, he wasn't very good, okay? Tacitus is looking at Pilate's rule and saying he was not a good governor. And being under direct Roman rule, again, made the people think, wow, we were better off under Herod. And so what's going on? Jesus kind of comes into a world in his adulthood, in his ministry, he comes into a world where everybody's looking for someone to rescue them from the yoke of Rome. And we'll talk about that more in lesson 4. All right, the end of the temple. So you guys know the story. Jesus, he has his ministry. He's crucified. He's resurrected. Okay. He spends time with his disciples preparing for his ascension. Then he ascends into heaven and the church is established. In the decades that follow that, okay, the relationship between Jerusalem and Rome was already bad, but it just continues to get worse and worse and worse. So that by 66 AD, there are revolutionary groups abounding, like the Zealots. The Zealots had been around for a while. The Sicarii were around. The Sicarii were, they were basically a group of assassins. They had named themselves after a knife called a sika. And these revolutionary groups had really captured the imagination of the people in Jerusalem. And what they end up doing, these religious fanatics sort of drag the people of Jerusalem into a war with Rome that they have basically no shot at winning. So a revolt starts in 66 AD, and Nero sends Vespasian to Jerusalem to deal with it. Then Nero promptly dies. And so Vespasian has to return to Rome. When he returns to Rome, he puts his son, Titus, in charge of the war in Jerusalem. Now, Vespasian, a little later, does become the emperor of Rome, and Titus follows in his footsteps and becomes the emperor as well. But the war goes on for a little while, and in 70 AD, Titus and the Romans lay siege to Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And at that point, sacrifice in the temple is ended and has never returned. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem is an important event in Jewish history. Okay, it is the decisive event of the first Jewish-Roman War. And the fact that it says first Jewish-Roman War tells you what? There was more than one. But this one kind of is a pretty decisive event in this war. But another important thing is that and I'm going to explain a little bit more of this in the last section. This is where you see Judaism and Christianity split for good. When Jesus was born into the world, Judaism was really very sectarian. There were lots of different groups. Okay, the Pharisees were a sect, the Sadducees were a sect, the Essenes. There were lots of different sects of Jerusalem. And Christianity was just seen as one more sect of Jerusalem, or I'm sorry, of Judaism. And then, but when the temple gets destroyed, that ends. And Christianity and Judaism become two separate things. Tension between Rome and Jerusalem doesn't just go away just because the first Jewish-Roman War ends. And it boils over again in the Bar Kokhba revolt of the 130s AD. Well, anyway, so I do want to cover one more thing. I wasn't sure if I would have time to get to this, but I think I'm going to have time to cover this, something called the Abomination of Desolation. Okay, I found this pretty interesting. I hope you will too. So interesting that I wrote a paper on it for the class when I took it. And here it goes. You ready for this? The Abomination of Desolation sounds pretty scary, does it not? Am I alone here? It sounds pretty scary, but Jesus talks about it, okay? Here's what happens. We're going to start with some prophecies, right? In Mark 13, upon leaving the temple, the disciples remark to Jesus about how magnificent the temple is. And Jesus responds, and you've probably read this before in Mark 13, he responds this way: not one stone here will be left on another. Basically, Jesus is telling them this temple is going to be destroyed. And then he goes up and sits on the Mount of Olives looking over Jerusalem, and the disciples come to him and they say, Jesus, when is this going to happen? In response, Jesus issues a warning. He says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, yeah, the NIV says the abomination that causes desolation. Growing up, my mom always read from the King James, right? And in the King James, it just says the abomination of desolation. Okay, but we're talking about something that's going to be so abominable that it causes the temple to be left desolate. Okay, well, what is that? That's what I want to kind of close out with. Okay, so I found this at BibleWalks.com. This is the view from the Mount of Olives. So you can imagine, obviously, Jerusalem looks a lot different now than it did then, but Jesus may have been sitting here where with this sort of view of Jerusalem, and the apostles come to him and they say, so when is all this going to happen? And so then he's telling them about this abomination that causes desolation. Well, what is he talking about? So, and he tells them, when you see this abomination, get out, run away fast. That's my own little paraphrase, right? When you see it, run away fast. If you read Mark 13, he says, flee to the mountains, leave everything behind. And he says, if you're on the roof, leave everything in your house behind. If you're working in the field, don't go back for your cloak, leave it behind. Get out of here. So then here's the question, that 3 questions actually. Well, what is the abomination of desolation? Will they know it when they see it? And did the disciples actually know what Jesus was talking about? Okay, because abomination that causes desolation is not a phrase that you hear every day, is it? All right. So when Jesus says in Matthew's account of it, Matthew 24, verse 15, he says, he uses this phrase, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. Okay. Now I want to make a note here, okay, that Jesus considers Daniel authentic. He considers Daniel's prophecy authentic. And the reason I'm saying that is that as we get into this, Daniel's prophecy, he also makes this prophecy about the abomination that causes desolation. And his prophecy is so accurate that liberal scholars don't believe Daniel wrote it. They think that Daniel, instead of being written, I mean, we believe that Daniel was written 6th century BC. Liberal scholars say, no, it's so close to what happened, it had to be written after it happened. Okay. And so that would have put it somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century BC. So we're off in our judgment by about 400 years here. Okay. So here's what it says in 3 different places in Daniel. He mentions the abomination that causes desolation. Daniel 9:27, 11:31, and 12:11. Here's what this abomination is going to do. It's going to put an end to sacrifice and offering, would show favor to those who forsake the covenant of God, that armed forces would desecrate the people, that people who know God would resist this abomination, and that this abomination would exalt and magnify himself above God. So all of this is in Daniel 9, 11, and 12, right? And I would encourage you to look at it, okay? It's interesting stuff, okay? So most historians consider that when Antiochus Epiphanes profaned the temple, this was what Daniel was. If you may not have a copy of the Maccabees handy, okay, but you could probably find it online, okay, or in a Catholic Bible, it would be in there. But you could see First Maccabees 1, 54 through 56, and Second Maccabees 6, 3 through 7, which I have in the notes here. Okay, this event checks off all of the boxes of Daniel's prophecy. Here's what it says in 2 Maccabees 6. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil, for the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles, who dallied with prostitutes and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews. Okay. Daniel says, this is what's going to happen. In the Maccabees report, this is exactly what happened. And that's why liberal scholars think Daniel couldn't possibly have written it. Okay. Now, we believe in Daniel's prophecies, or at least I do, and I assume that you do too. Okay. That Daniel could have written it because he was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Okay. For what it's worth. Okay. So that's what Daniel was talking about when he prophesied about the abomination that causes desolation. Okay. Those who accepted Antiochus Epiphanes' ways were rewarded. Those who did not were punished or even killed. You can see I included a picture there of them offering a pig for sacrifice on the altar. Daniel's prophecy must have been about Antiochus Epiphanes. It fits too perfectly for him to be referring to something else. So then what was Jesus talking about? He couldn't have been talking about Antiochus Epiphanes because it had already happened. It had happened 160 years before or so, almost 200 years before, actually. But the disciples undoubtedly knew the reference, okay, the abomination that causes desolation. But did they understand what he was saying would happen? Was the temple going to be defiled again? Looking back, now at Jesus, what we call the Olivet Discourse, Jesus sitting on the Mount of Olives, he's referring to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD or 70 CE. This discourse is in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, okay? And they all kind of have some different details in there, all right? But what is Jesus referring to when he says the abomination that causes desolation? Okay. Some people believe that Jesus is making an end of time prophecy, but that doesn't make any sense if you read the whole thing. In Mark 13, it says, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened, okay? And so he says, this is going to happen for some of you in your lifetime. Some hold that the abomination refers to Jewish leadership of the time, the guys that were fomenting this rebellion. If you remember, Jesus was very critical of the leadership. He drove out the money changers from the temple and said, you've turned a house of prayer for all nations into a den of robbers. Well, those that hold this opinion say, hey, Jesus said this was supposed to be for all nations. They were busy trying to drive out all nations, okay? That they were trying to stage this rebellion to do the opposite of what the temple was even there for, okay? And there's a lot of, this does make some sense, could be. I'm more inclined to go with this. Other people believe that it's just the destruction of the temple itself that is the abomination that causes desolation. In Luke 21, here's what Luke records as a part of Jesus, warning them. He says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so you say, well, hey, when the city's getting surrounded by armies, by the Romans, get out. Okay, and so the temple gets destroyed. Temple sacrifice ends. Okay, and so this is the idea that makes the most sense to me. I read and heard some other kind of obscure ideas. The truth is, we don't really know for sure. It could be something else that happened that we don't even know about. It's quite possible. But I personally think that the abomination that causes desolation is the destruction of the temple. Okay, I'm just about to bring this in for a landing, okay? So I know I'm going a little long here, but I'm almost done. Here's what we know about the abomination of desolation. We don't know exactly what Jesus is referring to, but we do know this, that when the disciples saw it, they got out. They knew that that's what it was. Eusebius records that the disciples left Jerusalem for a city called Pella in Perea shortly before the war broke out with the Romans. Okay, so they saw the abomination of desolation, even though we're talking like 35, 37 years later, something like that, right? They saw it, word of mouth, get out when you see this. They got out. Okay, all right, so here we go. Here's some takeaways. You may have more takeaways, I do, but here's some that I want us to remember. God is at work even when the Bible is silent. Each of those empires, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, even the Hasmoneans, okay, they were setting up the Mediterranean world for the spread of the gospel. Okay, we don't have any prophetic voice for about 400 years, but that doesn't mean that God was not at work. Okay, second, Jeremiah, great prophet. Daniel, great prophet. Jesus, the greatest prophet, right? And what they said would happen, happened. And finally, just like our brothers and sisters in Jerusalem, in the time leading up to the destruction of the temple, it still hasn't changed. If you listen to Jesus, you are wise. And I'm going to stop sharing here. Okay, that's what I got for you. That's it.